A trust may be defined as a corporation which controls so large a proportion of a given product as to be able to determine the price and conditions of sale. The evil of a monopoly is that it destroys competition and leaves the producer at the mercy of a corporation which can then arbitrarily exact such profits as it pleases. There are certain results which naturally follow from the establishment of a private monopoly. First, profitable and great private by a monopoly, while the masses are the victims of all monopolies. Monopolies are both corruptive and coercive. By large contributions to campaign funds, they purchase immunity from restraining legislation and from the enforcement of the law. And as they employ an army of laboring men, they can influence elections by threatening employees with starvation.
George and Herman Brown of the Brown and Root Construction Company. Johnson helped the Brown brothers build a billion-dollar construction empire. In turn, the Browns would fund Johnson's political campaigns.
Judgmentally, what I'd say is that they were a couple of guys who were making a lot of money out of the New Deal, and they didn't want to have to pay higher wage rates, so they were against the unions. It wasn't a matter of high principle. They wanted to get rich, and they did get rich. Well, Lyndon sidled up to them, or they sidled up to him, and they made book. I remember asking Johnson once in the White House, did you deal with cash? And he said it was all cash. I mean, there were no records. So in those circumstances, there were plenty of politicians who were selling out to business interests. I use a pejorative term. I don't know what other term to use. I mean, in TV, you have to use some shorthand. I mean, they were agreeing to be with those people in exchange for money, which they used in their campaigns. That's pretty close to selling out, isn't it? And everything is organized not like his father around ideas and ideals, but like the son around himself and his own career. Not to say that he is not therefore doing a lot of good. He brings real electricity to people that don't have it in his own district. Yeah, sure, he's really smart.
On May 2nd, 1939, George Brown wrote Johnson a letter. I hope you know, Lyndon, how I feel in reference to what you've done for me, and I'm going to try to show my appreciation through the years with actions rather than words.
That morning, as Johnson and Kennedy arrived in Dallas, a Maryland insurance agent, Don Reynolds, arrived on Capitol Hill to brief Republican staff members of the Rules Committee. He'd promised proof that the vice president had misused his office for personal gain. He showed the investigators invoices, documents, and diary entries he claimed implicated the vice president.
John presented a good case. He could back it up. Everything he said he had a receipt for. It's hard to argue with a receipt or a canceled check or an invoice. It's hard to argue with documentation.
3:30, Chief Counselor Van Kirk was called out of the deposition to be told Jack Kennedy had been killed, that Lyndon Johnson had been sworn in as the 36th President of the United States.
Constitution of the United States.
I knew that if I went back in and told Don Reynolds that Lyndon Johnson was the new president, Kennedy was dead, he'd clam up. So I just went back in and said nothing, and we continued the interview for another 2 or 3 hours. And I tried to get every bit of information out of him I could.
The tragedy in Dallas stalled the investigation for a while. Johnson had no idea that as he was being sworn in, Reynolds was handing over evidence the Republicans hoped to use to impeach him. All he knew at that stage was that continuity was essential, that his team should include all the dead president's staff. This included his nemesis, the Attorney General Robert Kennedy.
For many minutes this afternoon, there was nobody actually at the helm of this great republic. The president lay dead of an assassin's bullet. The vice president, Lyndon B. Johnson, was incommunicado in a hospital suffering from shock. But now, just moments ago, Lyndon B. Johnson has been sworn in as the President of the United States. What is the position that he occupied in terms of his relationship with John F. Kennedy before this act today?
One of the key men in this case is Clint Murchison. Clint Murchison is an oil millionaire, owned 500 companies, but he was primarily an oil millionaire. He also controlled Texas, controlled Johnson. His major means of operating and controlling people and influencing people was a little hotel called the Hotel Del Charro in La Jolla, California. It cost $100 a day in the 50s. And at that hotel, he would invite all these powerful, influential people. Richard Nixon would come there. Key lieutenants of Carlos Marcello, the head of the mafia in New Orleans, used to vacation there. J. Edgar Hoover, the head of the FBI, used to vacation there. Free. Every summer for 10 summers. Free.
Another Johnson man with close ties to Murchison was a wealthy Texan called D.H. Byrd.
D.H. Byrd was an underboss for Murchison. He was a Del Charro regular. He owned the Texas School Book Depository. He also founded the Civil Air Patrol, which was a kind of military organization, and Lee Harvey Oswald was a member of the Civil Air Patrol. Another associate of Murchison at the time is Bobby Baker. Bobby Baker's in trouble with the scandals, and he was in all kinds of business deals with Murchison, and many of them were illegal. So Murchison was concerned that Baker and that corruption would lead to his door. And maybe not only would Baker go to jail and Lyndon go to jail, but maybe Murchison would go to jail.
Clint Murchison Sr. was one of the wealthiest men in Texas. He was an old-time wildcatter. And he and Sid Richardson had bought the license to run a famous racetrack in California called Del Mar. J. Edgar Hoover spent each August at their racetrack in their box and as their guest in their suite at the hotel there.
Hoover's own snapshots hinted how Murchison, too, indulged Hoover's taste for a one-way bet.
He invested in oil wells, and if the oil well went dry, he got his money back. Before he purchased stock, he wanted to know what the inside information was. He got it, then purchased stock, which is all illegal for any citizen.
And old man Murchison told me that the most important person in the world to be close to was the sheriff, and he owned a piece of Mr. Hoover because he felt by making certain that he had the box on the finish line, paying his hotel bills and his food bills, that he owned a piece of Hoover. No doubt about it. He was immune practically from any federal investigation of any of his activities.
And was Hoover's attitude toward organized crime influenced by the generosity of a Murchison or a Rosenstiel? One day, the gangster Meyer Lansky spoke about his virtual immunity from the FBI.
He says, if you'll note, he says he doesn't go after anybody like Santo, myself, Carlos in Louisiana. He says he doesn't touch any of us.
Santos Traficante was the mafia chieftain in Tampa. Carlos Marcello was the godfather of New Orleans.